We could probably have a whole course and I could dedicate a website. And there have been websites dedicated to the topic of bias. We introduce it, or I introduce it early on here because we're going to talk about bias throughout the material on this website. And so it's good to have an idea of what it is. We're not going to spend the time going through all types of biases that could occur because that would take forever. So I like to think of bias as effects caused by academic and research activities which may mislead scientific discovery. And they creep in everywhere. They creep in measurement, in the study design and execution, in the analysis and reporting, and the publishing and synthesis of results. So bias is really something that we should think about all the time as we engage in the scientific process. There's a website known as the Catalog of Bias. It's linked here. It's a great website. It contains a list of different types of biases, and you can click on them and you can read more about the type of bias and get some references and more information on them. Super useful. They have this definition of bias, and it says, bias enters health studies at all stages and often influences the magnitude and direction of results. To obtain the least biased information, researchers must acknowledge that potential presence of bias and take steps to avoid and minimize their effects. Equally, in assessing the results of studies, we must be aware of the different types of biases, their potential impact, and how this affects interpretation and use of evidence in healthcare decision-making. The Catalogue of Bias is certainly focused on health studies, but we should be aware that bias actually enters the process of the scientific process in other disciplines as well, not just in health. The BMJ in this resource I mentioned earlier, Epidemiology for the Uninitiated, has this definition. Epidemiological studies measure characteristics of populations. The parameter of interest may be disease rate, the prevalence of an exposure, or more often some measure of the association between an exposure and disease. Because studies are carried out on people and have all the attendant practical and ethical constraints, they are almost invariably subject to bias. Basically, you're not going to escape it. You're going to have to deal with it. Bias is always going to be present in your studies, and there's no way of saying that you're entirely free from it. This is a classical picture which many use, but it's quite informative because we want to sort of distinguish bias from error or just natural variance. So if you had an unbiased study, an unbiased measurement, and very low error, then you're hitting the target. You're trying to hit the target here, and you're doing that as well. It's unbiased. You're hitting the center of the target, and the error is low. So the spread of your measurements are very close to each other. If you had an unbiased study and high error, then your measurements would still be hitting the middle, but you would have a lot of variance and high error. So you'd be missing the middle, but you're really aiming and hitting the middle once your error is low. On the other hand, if your study is biased and has a low error, you're doing great measurements, but they're off target. So you're systematically sort of measuring the wrong thing. It's not just randomly measuring the wrong thing, as it was here. Here, we're randomly measuring the wrong thing. Here, it's systematic. You're missing the target completely. And then, of course, if you have biased and it's high error, then you're just all over the place. Okay? So I think this is enough to just think about what we mean with error and sampling error and randomness compared to bias, which is sort of systematically changing our results. Now, one type of bias, which I would like to just emphasize here, which has been overlooked, especially in randomized controlled trials, are research participation effects. They are caused by study activities such as signing consent forms, screening, treatment allocation, and outcome assessment. Now, as I mentioned, these biases haven't really received much attention as other types of biases have, and in particular with respect to randomized controlled trials. But we won't talk too much about them in the material on this website at the moment. And so if you're interested, there's a video here you can watch. It's a 1-hour seminar that I gave in a different context. And it gives you a little bit of insight to this research participation effects construct.